In January of 2026, a single gold Camaro rolled across an auction stage in Kissimmee, Florida, and the room went quiet in a way that only happens when everyone realizes they're watching history change price. $1,815,000. The most expensive Camaro that has ever changed hands. But here's what nobody puts in the headline. This car never wore a championship trophy. It was never built by a factory racing team. And the man who eventually bought it in 1969 didn't just buy a fast Chevrolet. He bought something insurance companies refused to touch, something General Motors' own engineers considered too unstable to put a warranty behind, something so violent in ordinary hands that Chevrolet spent the next 2 years trying to make sure nothing like it could ever reach a showroom floor again. This isn't the story of a fast car. It's the story of a machine that was, by design, too dangerous to own, and the 4 men who built it anyway. The racer who refused to low start with the name people already know, but not the sanitized version. Don Yenko wasn't a car dealer with a hobby. He was a national champion who happened to sign the paperwork on a dealership. He had a pilot's license before he could legally vote. He won the Sports Car Club of America's B production title in back-to-back seasons, 1962 and 1963. He raced at Daytona. He raced at Sebring. He drove in the 24 Hours of Le Mans, the single hardest endurance race on the planet. Against factory teams with budgets his little Chevrolet dealership couldn't dream of matching. So when Don Yenko said a car wasn't fast enough, that wasn't a sales pitch. That was a professional diagnosis from a man who had felt the difference with his own hands on a wheel at 150 miles per hour. And in 1969, the very year this story takes place, Yenko proved he could still win at the highest level, taking a Camaro of his own building to victory in the Citrus 250 at Daytona International Speedway, beating a field that included Peter Gregg, Bob Tullius, Parnelli Jones, and Lloyd Ruby, a murderer's row of American racing talent. But by the mid-1960s, Yenko had a problem eating at him. His Corvettes were getting heavier, softer, less like weapons, and more like luxury items. Meanwhile, over at Ford, Carroll Shelby was turning ordinary Mustangs into Predators, and a rising star named Mark Donohue was making a career out of leaving Chevrolets in his mirrors. Yenko said it himself, in a line that still carries a sting decades later. He was tired of staring at the rear bumper of Mark Donohue's Mustang. Sit with that sentence for a second. This is a Le Mans driver, a national champion, admitting that a Ford was beating him often enough that it had become personal. Most dealers in his position would have shrugged and sold what the factory gave them. Yenko went hunting for a weapon instead. But there was a wall standing directly between him and what he wanted. And that wall wasn't a person. It was a policy. A number written in a boardroom General Motors had drawn a hard corporate line, and it applied to every intermediate and pony car in the lineup. No engine larger than 400 cubic inches. Full-size sedans could carry the big motors. The Corvette could carry the big motors. But the Camaro, the Chevelle, the Nova, the cars that mattered most to a driver like Yenko, were capped on purpose. That meant the biggest engine you could legally order in a 1969 Camaro through the front door was a 396, and to a racer who had already beaten the best drivers in America, a 396 wasn't an answer. It was an apology stamped onto an order form. Why did this ceiling exist? This is where the story turns darker than most retrospectives are willing to admit. It wasn't really about safety, not in the way the public was told. General Motors leadership was afraid of 2 things: insurance companies, who had started punishing young buyers with premiums that made fast cars unaffordable, and regulators, who were beginning to circle the entire performance car industry with real teeth. The horsepower war was roaring across every dealership lot in America, and the executives at the very top were already quietly trying to smother it before it caught real political fire. So the corporation drew its line at 400 cubic inches. Not a person, not a face, a policy. A faceless, deliberate ceiling built to keep the wildest engines out of the lightest, cheapest, most dangerous in the wrong hands cars on the market. For 2 years, Yenko fought that ceiling the hard way. He ordered brand new Camaros straight off the truck, then had his own mechanics tear the factory 396 out and stuff in a 427 pulled from Corvette stock. Picture that for a moment, a factory fresh car up on a lift, being gutted before it had ever touched a public road. In 1967, his shop managed to build 54 of these conversions. In 1968, 64. Every single one was slow to produce, brutally expensive, and back-breaking labor for his crew. It worked. It just didn't scale. And Yenko understood there had to be a smarter door somewhere in the system. He just couldn't find the handle by himself. He needed a man on the inside. The man who held the keys. His name was Vince Piggins, and if Yenko is the face people remember, Piggins is the ghost who made it all technically possible. Piggins ran product promotion inside Chevrolet. He never earned an engineering degree, but insiders will tell you he understood engines better than half the men who had. He's widely credited as the father of the Z28. And somewhere deep inside General Motors bureaucracy, he had found something that would quietly reshape muscle car history. A boring, forgettable ordering mechanism called the Central Office Production Order, COPO. Here's what COPO actually existed for: fleet vehicles, police interceptors, taxi orders, special paint runs for corporate buyers, heavy-duty cooling packages for companies running vehicles through the desert, dull, invisible back-office paperwork designed to let large customers order things that weren't on the normal consumer menu. It was never built with muscle cars in mind, and that is exactly why it worked. Piggins realized something the executives above him had completely missed. The 400 cubic inch ceiling wasn't an engineering law, it was a marketing policy, enforced only through the standard options list. COPO didn't run through the options list, COPO went around it entirely. If a fleet buyer could special order a heavy-duty axle through COPO, then in theory a dealer could special order a heavy-duty engine the exact same way. The rulebook had a side door, and almost nobody inside the company had ever bothered trying the handle. And here's the detail that proves Yenko wasn't gambling blind. He had already used this exact move once before. Back in 1966, before the Camaro even existed, Yenko had used the same COPO trick to build a run of hopped-up Corvairs, the Yenko Stinger, turning Chevrolet's humble economy car into a genuine giant killer on road courses. Piggins had run the same play himself. He had slipped a batch of big block Novus out to an Illinois drag racer named Fred Gibb. He had helped push through the legendary all-aluminum Z-Lone engine, a motor so exotic it nearly doubled a car's sticker price, all authorized under a COPO code of its own. So when Don Yenko came knocking in the summer of 1968, asking for something that sounded impossible, a factory-built 427 Camaro, Piggins didn't laugh him out of the office. He reached for a form. The code they landed on was COPO 9561. It authorized the L72 427 to be bolted directly onto the assembly line right alongside the ordinary grocery getters rolling off the same plant floor. Paired with it was a second code, COPO 9737, the sports car conversion package, adding heavy-duty suspension, and a distinctly ominous 140-mile-per-hour speedometer, 2 code numbers. That's all it took to erase a 2-year-old corporate wall. But a code number doesn't make a car survivable at speed. Somebody had to know how to actually make these things run without tearing themselves apart. That's where the third horseman rides into the story, carrying a reputation and a grudge. Mr. Chevrolet and the falling out. His name was Dick Harrell. The racing world called him Mr. Chevrolet, and by any honest measure, he was one of the fastest, most feared Chevy drag racers alive at the time. Before the factory ever built a single COPO Camaro, it was men like Harrell doing the dangerous, unglamorous engineering, figuring out how to shoehorn a monstrous 427 into a car that was never designed to hold one. Harrell had cut his teeth working with Nicky Chevrolet in Chicago, another legendary performance dealership, and he's widely believed to have been among the first people anywhere to drop a 427 into a Camaro meant for public sale. When Yenko launched his supercar ambitions, Harrell stood right there beside him, lending hard-won knowledge to make those brutal early conversions actually function. Harrell's influence reached far past the wrench, too. He was respected and feared enough on the strip that he personally leaned on the American Hot Rod Association until they created an entirely new racing class built specifically to hold these dealer-built 427 specials. Chevrolet itself later leaned on Harrell's expertise to help develop its exotic aluminum Z-Lone racing engine. When the factory needs your help building their own race motor, you're not a mechanic anymore. You're a force of nature. But here's the human drama the glossy auction catalogs conveniently leave out. Yenko and Harrell didn't ride off into the sunset side by side. By the middle of 1968, the two men had reached what history politely calls irreconcilable differences. The partnership fractured. Yenko carried the Camaro program forward alone. Two enormous egos, two racing legends, one small performance world, and it wasn't big enough to hold both of them comfortably. That's the detail that makes this real. This wasn't a corporate committee humming along in harmony. This was a pressure cooker of stubborn, brilliant, occasionally furious men who couldn't always stand to be in the same room. And out of that friction came the fastest streetcars America had ever produced. Harrell rode off to keep building his own legend. Tragically, he died young in a racing accident in 1971, years before anyone would decide these machines were worth a fortune. But his fingerprints are stamped into the DNA of every 427 Camaro that ever launched off a starting line. Remove him from the story, and the knowledge simply isn't there to build the car at all. 3 horsemen down: the dealer, the insider, the gunfighter, but there was a fourth man, and he had already answered the one question everybody else was too afraid to ask out loud. The engineer who proved it wouldn't kill you. The fourth horseman is the one almost nobody names, Bill Thomas. Thomas was the engineering mind connected to Dana Chevrolet, a California dealership that had already done the brutal early work of developing a 427 conversion for the Camaro platform. Before Yenko's operation was humming, before a single COPO form was ever filed, somebody had to prove, mechanically, physically, under real load, that jamming the biggest engine Chevrolet made into the smallest chassis it made wouldn't simply tear the car apart at the first hard launch. That's what pioneers like Thomas actually contributed. The cooling solutions, the drivetrain geometry, the sheer physics of stuffing 7 liters of iron into a nose engineered for a small block. When Yenko and his crew finally sorted out how to build these cars reliably, they weren't inventing from a blank page. They were standing on engineering that men like Bill Thomas and Dick Harrell had already bled for, quietly years earlier, with no fame attached to it at all. So there they are, the 4 horsemen: Don Yenko, who had the nerve, Vince Piggins, who had the keys, Dick Harrell, who had the speed, Bill Thomas, who had the proof. 4 men, 4 completely different skill sets, one forbidden machine that shouldn't have been able to exist. Now, let's talk about the engine at the center of all of it, because it carries a secret history that reaches all the way back to a moonlit NASCAR conspiracy. An engine with a criminal past. On paper, the engine was called the L72, a 427 cubic inch Chevrolet big block. On the strip and in the garages, it had a different name entirely. They called it the Rat. Chevrolet's big blocks were Rat motors, huge, heavy, mean, loud, the natural enemy of Ford's Hemi. The small blocks were mice. The big ones were rats, and the L72 was one of the nastiest rats Chevrolet ever legally sold to the public. But where did the Rat actually come from? Here's the twist. Most retrospectives never touch. The Rat motor was born in secret as a NASCAR weapon. Back in 1963, Chevrolet had been officially banned from racing by its own corporate parent, so the company built an engine in the shadows anyway. The Mark II, a secretive 427, that racers only ever whispered about as the mystery motor. One of the industry's finest engineers, Richard Dick Kyneth, led its design, and when it was time to unleash it onto a real racetrack, the very first examples went to a mechanic in Daytona Beach with a reputation for pure genius and pure rule-bending, Smokey Yunick. Yunick got the first mystery motors and rolled into Daytona in 1963 to shock the entire establishment. The engine was so secret that Chevrolet's own public relations department refused to release a single photograph of it. It was developed and tested far from prying eyes, out at a proving ground in the Arizona desert, instead of the usual Michigan test tracks, specifically to keep it hidden from a corporate parent that had officially outlawed racing entirely. This was Chevrolet fighting a war. It wasn't even allowed to admit it was fighting. That secret NASCAR 427 with its distinctive canted valves standing up like porcupine quills. The very detail that may have earned the Rat its nickname became the blueprint for the entire Mark IV big block family that followed. The 396, the 427, the 454. Every Rat motor Chevrolet ever built traces its bloodline directly back to that clandestine engine, born in the shadows to win stock car races. Nobody was supposed to know Chevrolet was even entering. So when 4 men slipped it into a gold Camaro 6 years later, they weren't bending the rules for the first time. They were carrying on a Chevrolet tradition of doing exactly that. By 1969, in its L72 street form, the engine carried an 11:1 compression ratio, a brutal solid lifter camshaft, big free-breathing heads, a 780 cubic feet per minute Holley 4-barrel sitting on an aluminum intake, forged steel connecting rods, a forged crankshaft, and 4-bolt main caps holding the entire assembly together under punishment. On the window sticker, Chevrolet rated it at a conservative 425 horsepower and 460 pound-feet of torque. And almost nobody who understood engines believed that number for a second. The number nobody believed, here's the game, everyone in Detroit was playing at the time. Insurance companies used the horsepower rating on the window sticker to set premiums. The higher the printed number, the more it cost a young buyer to legally insure the car, and the more unwanted attention the entire performance program drew from nervous executives and circling regulators. So the manufacturers played dumb on purpose. They rated their wildest engines conservatively, deliberately, as a form of institutional camouflage. The 425 horsepower figure stamped on the LS72 wasn't exactly a lie. It was a disguise. Don Yenko understood this game perfectly, and he played his own hand inside it. In his advertising, he winked directly at the truth, quoting his Camaros at 450 horsepower, a number that told every serious enthusiast reading the ad. You and I both know the factory sheet is fiction. It was marketing built entirely on an open secret. It made every buyer feel like an insider who was in on the joke the moment they signed the paperwork. And there was a bigger reason this power mattered in 1969 specifically. Across the battlefield, Ford had just unveiled a monster of its own, the Boss 429 Mustang, a homologation special built purely to dominate NASCAR. Chevrolet officially had no direct factory answer. The corporation was too busy policing its own 400 cubic inch ceiling to build a proper rival in daylight. So the Yenko Camaro and its COPO cousins quietly became Chevrolet's unofficial reply. Four men, working entirely through a paperwork loophole, handed the bowtie a weapon capable of facing the blue oval's best, a weapon the corporation itself had officially refused to build. The irony is almost too clean. Whatever the true horsepower number actually was, and dyno builders have argued about it for 50 years now, the important part was always what it felt like from behind the wheel. Owners have described the LSE-22 the same way for 5 decades. You'd think the engine was finished pulling, and then it would find a second wind and keep going. It didn't run out of breath, it ran out of road, but feelings don't win arguments. Numbers on a timing slip do, and to get those numbers, somebody had to actually take the car to a real strip and run it for real. The one they built before the others. Before Chevrolet could build 201 Yenko Camaros, it had to build exactly one first, a pilot car, a prototype, the very first COPO 9561 Yenko Super Camaro, built to prove the entire concept worked before the assembly line spun up to full production. That car was painted Olympic gold, and it is, without argument, the single most important Yenko Camaro in existence. It rolled out of the Norwood, Ohio assembly plant, carrying every piece the program promised. The L72 427, the M21 4-speed transmission, the bulletproof 12-bolt rear axle running steep 4.10 gears, power front disc brakes, a set of Doug Thorley headers, and the Yenko graphics package. This wasn't a concept sketch, it wasn't a show car sitting under lights. It was the working prototype, the proof of the entire loophole, cast in steel and gold paint, and it was sold to a real ordinary customer. A man named Ronald Welsh bought this exact pilot car brand new, straight from Yenko Chevrolet in 1969. Not a museum, not a sealed collector vault, a guy who drove it on real roads. Then came the moment that turned the prototype into a genuine legend. In 1969, drag racer Ed Hedrick took this exact car to the strip for Superstock and Drag Illustrated magazine. 6 passes. The only preparation was racing slicks and open headers. No engine surgery, no built motor, nearly a showroom car simply breathing a little freer with sticky tires underneath it. The result, an 11.94 second quarter mile at 114 miles per hour. Sit with that for a moment. In 1969, a car you could theoretically special order and drive straight home ran deep into the 11-second range with almost nothing done to it. There were purpose-built dedicated race cars of that era that couldn't manage that number. And this thing still had a factory warranty attached to it. Photos and trophies placed the prototype racing at Pittsburgh International Dragway around 1970. This car didn't sit quietly in a garage. It fought. And this is the part collectors obsess over decades later. A prototype is supposed to be disposable, a test mule the factory uses once to prove a concept, then quietly scraps or buries in a warehouse. Most pilot cars simply vanish into history. This one didn't. It got sold to a customer, it got raced, it got driven hard. And against every reasonable odd, it survived, with its original heart still beating under the hood decades later. That's the exact difference between this car and the other 200 that followed it off the line. The others were the production run, the soldiers. This was the first shot fired, the single car that proved 4 men had actually beaten General Motors at its own game, using General Motors' own internal paperwork to do it. But a system that's been beaten this cleanly doesn't stay quiet forever. The window slams shut. Here's the tragedy hiding just underneath the triumph. The loophole worked precisely because nobody inside the company was watching it closely. And the moment it worked too well, that stopped being true. The COPO trick stayed invisible as long as it was quietly moving taxis and police fleets through the system. But once it started producing 11-second streetcars sold directly to teenagers, it stopped looking clever and started looking genuinely dangerous to exactly the same executives who had built the 400 cubic inch ceiling in the first place. The antagonist of this entire story, that faceless corporate caution, was already winning the wider war outside the drag strip. Insurance premiums on muscle cars were becoming punishing. Emissions regulations were tightening month over month. And the executives who had never wanted these engines built in the first place finally had the leverage they needed to act decisively. By 1970, the fire was being deliberately smothered. Compression ratios started dropping across the board. Horsepower ratings began sliding downward on paper and in reality. The same corporation that had quietly looked the other way while four men slipped a race-bred engine into a pony car now spoke an entirely new corporate language: safety, economy, responsibility. The window that Yenko, Piggins, Harrell, and Thomas had pried open slammed shut almost as fast as it had opened. 1969 was the last full year Don Yenko built his 427 Camaros. By 1970, he had already pivoted, dropping a smaller, higher-revving 350 into his Yenko Deuce Nova instead, a smart concession to a market that no longer had any appetite for a rat motor under the hood, or the ownership risk that came bundled with it. The four horsemen had ridden straight through a door that was already closing behind them as they passed through it. And that fact right there is exactly why the gold prototype is worth what it's worth today. Why $1.08 million? So why did this specific car sell for $1.08 million? Not because it's the fastest surviving example, not because it's the prettiest. Because it's the first, and because the collector world finally, fully understood what first actually means for a car this dangerous to have ever legally existed. For decades, Yenko Camaros were valued simply as fast, rare muscle cars. A genuinely excellent example might sell somewhere in the $200,000 to $400,000 range. Even a strong 1969 example sold at a Macom auction in 2025 for around $715,000. Serious money, but nowhere near record-setting money. Then, in January of 2026, the collection of the late Cliff Ernst came up for sale at Macom's Kissimmee event. Ernst was a Tennessee collector who had built his fortune in injection-molded plastics and passed away in 2024. Decades earlier, back in 1987, he had bought something genuinely extraordinary directly from its original owner, the Olympic Gold Pilot car, number 1. By the time it crossed the auction block, the car had been meticulously restored by Muscle Car CPR-X in Monaca, Pennsylvania. But crucially, it still carried its original numbers-matching engine, its original rear axle, its original trim tag, and a stack of period paperwork most collector cars can only dream of possessing. The original order form, the Protect O plate, even the owner's manual. In collector language, that isn't just a car. That's a documented, unbroken chain of custody stretching back to the exact moment this engine family was born. And the room knew precisely what it was looking at. This wasn't a car being sold. It was a piece of history being formally crowned. The bidding climbed past $1 million, past the old record, past the point where the numbers stopped being about metal and started being about meaning entirely. The hammer finally fell at $1,650,000. With the buyer's premium added, the final total hit $1,815,000. It didn't just edge past the previous Camaro auction record, it obliterated it. The old mark had stood at just over $1 million. This gold car very nearly doubled it. Because the buyer that day wasn't really bidding on horsepower. They were bidding on the exact moment four men rewrote a corporation's rulebook and got away with it. However briefly, you can buy speed almost anywhere in almost any decade. You can only ever buy first once. Why owning it still feels dangerous today? Here's what's strange. People who weren't even alive in 1969 look at this car today and feel a genuine chill run through them. And it isn't just nostalgia doing that. It's honesty. The car is brutally honest about exactly what it is. There's no drive mode to soften it. No traction control light blinking reassurance at you from the dash. No layer of software quietly standing between your right foot and a race-bred rat motor breathing through a Holley carburetor. You turn the key, and a secret NASCAR engine, the great-grandchild of Smokey Yunick's mystery motor, shakes the entire car at idle, daring whoever's sitting behind the wheel to actually commit. Period road testers described these cars the exact same way. Decade after decade, brutally fast, and utterly unforgiving. A machine that rewarded total confidence and punished the slightest hesitation without warning. That 140-mile-per-hour speedometer wasn't a boast printed on the dash for marketing purposes. On a car this light, wrapped around an engine this violent. It was closer to a warning label, and you simply cannot fake any of that. Modern recreations, tribute builds, official continuation models, none of them are this. This is the actual first shot, the genuine article, the single car that four stubborn, brilliant, occasionally furious men willed into existence through a crack in a giant corporation's own rulebook. That feeling, not the sheet metal, not the paint, is what actually sold for $1.08 million. To deserve Defender, so the four horsemen won, they beat the ceiling, they built the car, and the gold prototype survives today. Worth more than most houses, standing as a monument to one brief moment when personal passion beat corporate policy fair and square. But here's the question that should genuinely sit with you tonight. We know the car survived. We know Don Yenko's name survived, printed proudly across the fender for 50-plus years. But of the four horsemen who actually made this machine possible, only one of them got his name on that fender at all. Vince Piggins, the man who actually held the keys to the loophole itself, is a footnote in most histories. Bill Thomas is a name the vast majority of enthusiasts have simply never heard. And Dick Harrell, Mr. Chevrolet, the man who helped make these cars genuinely fast before he and Yenko bitterly split apart, died at the wheel of a race car in 1971, years before anyone had decided these machines would ever be worth millions of dollars. Four men opened the door together. One got the glory. Three got quietly forgotten by history. And the corporation that spent 2 solid years actively trying to stop all four of them, it's still standing today, and it now proudly sells the very Yenko name it once tried hard to smother in its own boardroom. So maybe the real dangerous truth here isn't about a car at all. Maybe it's this. The muscle car era we all romanticize wasn't actually built by the corporation whose badge sits on the hood. It was built by a small handful of restless individuals who found the cracks in the system and slipped through them before anyone in charge noticed what was happening. Which raises the question I genuinely want you to answer in the comments. If this loophole only ever worked because nobody was watching closely enough, were the four horsemen heroes who gave the world some of the greatest cars ever built? Or were they simply lucky enough to walk out of the bank before anyone remembered to lock the door? And here's the one that'll really start a fight down there. Which of the four horsemen actually deserved to have his name stamped on that fender? Was it Yenko, the racer with the nerve, Piggins, the insider who held the keys, Harrell, the gunfighter with the raw speed, or Thomas, the engineer who quietly supplied the proof that made the whole thing survivable? And one more question before you go. If you personally owned the $1.08 million prototype sitting in your garage tonight, would you actually drive it, or would you preserve it forever, untouched, exactly the way it survived? Tell me below. Tell me who this story forgot.